Welcome to the Invisible Hand podcast from the Adam Smith Center in Singapore. The center aims to promote the study of philosophy, politics, and economics in the classical liberal tradition through research and public education. In our podcast, we talk to economists, political scientists, and thought leaders around the world to unveil the invisible hand. My name is Brian Chiang, and I'm the director of this center. Today, our guest is Dr. Carmelo Ferlito. Dr. Carmelo Ferlito is a senior fellow at the Institute for Democracy and Economic Affairs in Kuala Lumpur. IDEAS is a leading and influential think tank based on market-based ideas in Malaysia. Dr. Ferlito is also an adjunct faculty member at International College Subang in Subang Jaya, where he teaches history of economic thought and microeconomic theory and policy. Today, he will be speaking with us on the topic of the contemporary relevance of the Austrian School of Economics. Dr. Carmelo, thank you very much for joining us on this episode of the show.
Thanks for inviting me. It's a pleasure.
So maybe we can just start off with a simple question because I think some of our listeners may not be familiar with this. What is the Austrian School of Economics and how would you explain it to them?
Well, if we look from an historical perspective, we can simply say that is a school of thought that originated with the publication of one book, Principle of Economics, authored by an Austrian economist called Karl Menger in 1871. So even if the present members are mostly non-Austrians, we still call it the Austrian School of Economics because it originated in Austria with an Austrian economist. Yeah, and it is recalled usually as one of the three leading schools in the so-called marginal revolution in the last quarter of the 19th century that brought the accent of the importance of subjective evaluations in determining the value of things.
And
That's how it started.
I see. And how would you see the relationship between the Austrian School of Economics and the theories of Adam Smith? Is it a continuation or are there some variations and improvements? Because I think many people, they know Adam Smith, right? They know Karl Marx, they know John Maynard Keynes. But so I'm just thinking, how do we fit this, Mengerian tradition, into that common understanding?
Yeah, well, it's a bit a peculiar relationship in the sense that when we talk about the marginal revolution in general, we intend something that, from a certain perspective, was radically opposite to the teaching of Adam Smith with regard to the so-called theory of value. So, according to Adam Smith, the value of things comes from objective features, in particular the labor included in a certain object. While with the marginal revolution, the subjectivist revolution, the value of things is determined by subjective evaluations. So, of course, on this perspective, Menger and Adam Smith are quite on opposite fronts. But if we look at the development of the Austrian school, we can find a lot of continuity. And I believe that the central point to look at this continuity is the concept of spontaneous order, intended as the result of human action but not human design, in the sense that actions, individual actions, have unintended consequences that are much bigger than what the subject intended while implementing a certain action. And on this, I would say that probably the Austrian school is the school that better developed such a concept that became so central in its own analysis.
And to a large extent, there's a lot of similarity in terms of policy conclusions, right? People who believe in the theories of Adam Smith, they want a more free market economy, and the Austrian School of Economics developed this idea a lot in the early 20th century to the socialist calculation debate.
Yes.
So maybe, could you just explain very briefly what was this socialist calculation debate and how do you see it evolve over the 20th century until what we have today?
Well, this is a long story. We might talk about this for a week, but just to cut it short, we all know that in the middle of World War I, there was the Soviet Revolution and the advent of a communist society, and Russia became USSR. So in general, economists started to wonder if there was indeed an alternative to a market, to a capitalistic system that maybe might be more stable than the capitalistic system. And brilliantly, Ludwig von Mises and Friedrich von Hayek, two of the most brilliant Austrian economists, developed a very sharp critiques against this pretension, which is based on two pillars: the information problems and the knowledge problem, that are very much interrelated. To summarize the knowledge problem, we can say that we have two types of knowledge. One thing is to know how to produce a chair. Okay, this is technical knowledge. Another thing is to know that the market needs a chair, and this is entrepreneurial knowledge. So to be an entrepreneur means to bet on the idea that the market needs a chair. And you don't necessarily need to know how to produce a chair. Technical knowledge can be purchased on the market. But then we come to the information problem: how entrepreneurs can reasonably bet on the idea that the market needs something. And this is because they continuously exchange information in the market itself via interaction with other individuals. And prices are the main device that transmit this kind of information. In a centrally planned society, basically, we eliminate the market, which is the place where prices are actually originated. If we don't have prices, we don't have information, and therefore we cannot generate entrepreneurial knowledge. That's why, according to Mises and Hayek, every kind of central planning is destined to fail by definition.
It seems to me, yeah.
If I may add, this argument is much stronger to many other arguments because it's a technical argument rather than a moral argument. We are not talking about, okay, the government doesn't have to interfere because I know better what is good for me. I want to be free to choose. Here we have a technical argument.
So the argument is, even if the government has good intentions to plan the economy and achieve good intentions, they lack the necessary knowledge and information that they require in order to achieve those objectives, whatever those objectives may be. Right? So this seems to me to be a very powerful critique of socialism and central planning, which of course in the early 1990s and the late 20th century, we saw the collapse of the Soviet Union. So I'm just wondering, given those trends, why don't we see more people subscribing to this school of economic thought, Austrian school of economics? Are there some developments within the mainstream branch of economics that maybe prevent people from understanding more about this? I'm just thinking about the reception of Austrian ideas in academia today.
Well, in general, as probably every econ student knows, the way in which economics is taught and then later on economics scholarship is perceived is rather different from what I described. Nowadays, we live in a moment of radical formalism. So I would say that we even don't have real economics in many universities. We just have econometrics. And if you try
That's
to read
strong statement to make, right? That's quite an interesting thing to say. I mean, that what people are studying is not real economics, right? How can you justify that?
Well, just take a simple example. Take a textbook of microeconomics and read the definition of perfect competition.
Yeah.
You will find out that according to all the worldwide textbooks, perfect competition is that system in which everybody is doing the same thing, using the same technology, and accepting a given price. And nobody has the power to discriminate on price or technology or knowledge.
That's the model of the market.
If we look at our experience in the day-to-day life of competition, is this? I believe that competition is based on differences rather than on equality.
Yes,
I
exactly.
mean, entrepreneurs win the competition in the market because they can do something better, because they are smarter in some way, because they are protected by the government, whatsoever, they are more lucky. But there is an element of difference that make them win, and competition is a dynamic concept. Rather, in the textbook, it becomes static, useless concept that is really, really opposite to the real concept of competition.
This is a really interesting point because we know in the economy, entrepreneurs, they are the driving force, right, of the
Yes.
economy. They come up with new products, they innovate, they compete. But it seems that in economics textbooks, there's no discussion of the entrepreneur, right? So that's a very
Yeah, as
strange
the
strange thing.
entrepreneur is the big absent, and even if we had a lot of great economists discussing a lot about entrepreneurs, but entrepreneurs basically disappeared from mainstream economics. I would say that, in particular, after World War II, there was a run toward formalization, and of course, introducing the entrepreneur, which is an element of disturbance of dynamic, go to destroy the tranquility that the beauty of formalism can give to economists. But what do we need as economists? We need beautiful formalism, or we need to describe reality.
So this really goes back down to the nature of social science and how we understand social science to be conducted. So it seems to me you're saying that the Austrian School of Economics is more realistic in its description of how the economy works, right? But then again, what is the usefulness of some of these simplifying assumptions? Can we just say, it's useless, right? So think of like a map, right? So in a map, the map is useful because we are not describing, how the mountains look like. We are abstracting away from all these things that we are not looking at so that we can understand what we really want to understand. So isn't these aren't these simplifying assumptions useful to some extent?
Yes, but and this is the freedom of the scholar, we have to know at which extent they are useful. In example, we all accept now one of the principles of the Austrian school, that is that we have a scale of preferences, we have a so-called utility as consumers, and we usually choose to buy something that give us a higher utility compared to something that give us less satisfaction. This is like an obvious conclusion. Okay, we all act to be better off. Okay, but when we translate this into measurable curves on x and y axis, then I think we are doing violence to our reality. We are raping reality.
And what then do you think about the new schools of economic thought that are emerging today, such as behavioral economics? Because it seems to me there is perhaps one similarity. Correct me if I'm wrong about the limitations of knowledge, right? That the behavioral school and the Austrian school share. So do you see that this similarity, and what do you think about the trends in behavioral economics today?
Well, indeed, probably Mises was the first among the behavioral economists. If we read Human Action, probably we don't need the behavioral economics. But the main difference that I see is that behavioral economists tend to use imperfection in knowledge to justify government intervention, while traditional Austrian economists use imperfection in knowledge to claim more freedom.
So, for a young student in economics who may be listening to this podcast, how would you, advise them to learn Austrian economics? What is the first step or the first thinker that they should encounter? Is it Mises? Is it Hayek? What would they read?
Well, I would say as a teacher that probably Menger and Mises are the best way to start, and Mises is probably the most dogmatic, and therefore is the most easy to learn and to understand. But later on, you have to move to Hayek, which is the more complex, probably among the Austrian economists. And if I have to share a peel of personal experience, the book that really turned me into an Austrian economist was the Economics of Time and Ignorance by Gerald O'Driscoll and Mario Rizzo. That book really put the econ that I was studying in college under a new light and turned me into an Austrian economist.
And what was the key concept in that book that got you, that opened your understanding on this?
It was the example that I mentioned before about perfect competition is from that book, and really that opened a new world to me.
So perhaps we can be more practical and think about how some of these ideas can explain policy challenges and contemporary economic issues. So what are some policy issues do you think Austrian economists have a lot to offer in terms of analysis? What's happening in the global economy, what's happening around in Asia, perhaps?
Well, Austrian economist is indeed full paradigm of economics that can enlighten a lot of troubles. First of all, in example, the trade war between USA and China. Austrian economists for sure do not encourage trade wars. They are for free trade, and there are a lot of justifications for these, theoretical justifications. Going more into details, I recently published a paper on the property market in Malaysia, analyzing the fluctuations of this market from a sort of Austrian theory of business cycle, and advocating some sort of reforms for the government. Another one, now in Malaysia we are discussing again about the possibility of having a national car producer, a new one.
That's
So
industrial
Dr.
policy,
Mahathir,
right? That's the use
Dr.
of
Mahathir was in love with this idea since the 90s,
the
the
national car
80s.
program. Yeah.
Yes. If we understand the socialist economic calculation debate from the Austrian perspective, we know why this is not the right solution for a country like Malaysia.
So that brings to mind, the argument of picking winners and losers, right? So when the government is investing in a national car program or investing in some industry, so according to the Austrian perspective, they may not have the knowledge to pick the right firm or the right technology that will succeed on the market, because it's a complex issue.
But it's even more than that. It's not necessarily the right technology. They might decide to take the top technology. Okay, this is an information that, thanks to the market, is available, but they don't really know if the market needs another car producer. In a moment in which we have, in example, high duties on the import of foreign cars. So maybe people would just need good cars that are affordable, and the best way is just to lift up the duties. But again, let the market do it. When the people will be free to act in the market, they will discover the best solution.
I think the difference you made between information and knowledge, the information and the knowledge problem, I think is very interesting, because many people think that, hey, we have more information today. We have the internet, we can hire experts in the government, we can do scenario planning. So how can you say we have less information? We have lots of information. We have people are using data analytics, right? And
Yeah,
top
but the
technology.
nature
And
of
why can't that be
information,
overcome?
what makes information, what turns information into knowledge, is an interpretative process. It's an interpretative process. So you receive an information, you digest it, and it becomes knowledge. But the way in which Brian will interpret this information today in Singapore is completely different from the way in which this information can be interpreted by your neighbor. And therefore, is only when this information can be exchanged that new knowledge can be indeed generated in a mutually beneficial way. Okay, this is one point. The other point is that this kind of information, because of the nature of human interaction, is continuously changing and evolving. So So government, but any central planner would be never able to keep track of these changes.
So it's the nature of information and how it's transmitted, and so this requires a market process whereby information is constantly communicated, exchanged, and only then we are discovering, right,
Yes, correct.
what should be produced.
Via prices.
And so there are no substitutes for the price mechanism, no
No, I believe
calculator,
not.
supercomputer, or any of that.
I think that would be just a fiction. But we have multiple examples of this failure, and the last one is Venezuela.
Where people are starving and going hungry because of some of the socialist policies that are implemented.
Yes,
Yeah.
basically the toilet paper is missing from the shelf in supermarkets, and a couple of days ago, the president admitted that his experiment was a total failure.
And you talked about the property market problem in Malaysia. This reminds me of, like the Great Recession in the United States in 2008. And there are many leading explanations that blame, the certain financial instruments, like the mortgage-backed securities, the credit default swaps, the bank deregulation, that led to some of these bad investments and the bubble, and it crashed. So what would an Austrian say about this?
Well, for sure, we have to recognize that there is a role that the government can play in this situation before any kind of bubble is generated. In example, in fixing good rules for a good credit system. Okay, this is very important framework that can be generated by the government. Okay. Then I believe, and this is not really an Austrian idea, that at a certain extent these kind of speculations are unavoidable. Okay, but
Is that based on the psychological nature of the herd mentality, the herd instinct, which can cause like mass exuberance or pessimism in the market?
yes, indeed, is when we see things going well, everybody get excited and nobody want to be left out. So we all try to grab a piece of cake, and this is what mostly generate the bubble. But the role of the credit system is important in eventually aggravating these bubbles. That's why, recently, in example, the Malaysian government proposed to introduce relaxed loans for allowing people to buy houses. And I released a statement in which I was saying that this solution would just prolong the bubble and keep the prices high. So in the end, it would be more debt and a bigger collapse for the households.
Are you referring to the actions of the central bank in Malaysia?
The government itself wanted to study a plan together with the central bank to introduce they call relaxed loans system for the bottom 40 to allow them to buy houses that in this moment are particularly expensive. But for sure, the solution is not to inflate more credit. This will only keep the prices higher. So my idea was let the bubble burst, which is the best way to get the prices moving down.
And what was the reception that you got from the Malaysian
Well,
government?
there was a lot of interest, and next week, together with other people from Ideas, we will have a meeting with the government to discuss the possibility of a common agenda on this problem. So we are making Austrian ideas matters at the center of the political debate in Malaysia.
In the policy circle in Malaysia. Well, hopefully
Yeah.
this is going to be a great influence to the neighboring countries, even in Singapore where I am, and in Indonesia as well.
Yeah. Hope
So
so. Yeah.
I'm just wondering, maybe some final thoughts. What are some other interesting developments you see in the world today that you are maybe concerned about in the economic sphere, and how would you see it from an Austrian lens?
Sorry again. Didn't get the question.
Yeah, I'm referring to the state of the global economy.
Okay.
And the trends in the Western Europe, the trends in Asia, and how do you see the global economy growing or moving in light of protectionist sentiments, in light of populism, in light of developments like anti-immigrant sentiments?
Well, is a very kaleidoscopic situation in which is very interesting also from the historical perspective. After few decades of relative openness of the markets and a favor toward free trade, we see a rising wave of protectionism, which I think we in the end will not benefit anybody. This is on trade. On free border of people, the situation is much more complex rather than trade, because there are countries that are really negatively affected by this situation. And I'm not using the rhetoric of the immigrants are stealing our jobs, but I'm talking more generally on the fact that if you are moving to a country, you have to be ready to accept the legal framework and the cultural framework of that country. I'm an immigrant myself. I'm a Catholic living in a Muslim country, and I accept the fact that in front of my apartment there is a mosque rather than a church. And I'm not going to kill people around because there is not a church in front of my house. And this was very clear to me when I came to Malaysia. But if we look at the immigration situation in Southern Europe, this is not really the case, which people are moving without accepting the legal framework of the hosting countries.
Well, that's definitely interesting. And so maybe one final question before we end, on back to Austrian economics. So what, comments or advice would you give to a young student in economics who wants to learn more about economics and, thinking about taking the plunge, where, he can learn more Austrian economics, and what are some final advice and concluding thoughts that you have?
Well, the final advice that I would give is that the economics that you learn in the textbook is not gospel. There are varieties of theories that emerged like rivers in the history of economic thought. So probably the most important exams for a future economist are economic history and history of economic thought, where we learn that economics is on an evolutionary path, and there are different perspectives that are fascinating. So I'd rather prefer to see student approaching Marxian economics rather than mainstream economics. It means that it might be a more vibrant student. So be open to many perspectives, study them, and confront always them with your own experience. So whenever you are studying a theory, look at your day-to-day life. Is this theory able to explain what's happening to my economic life or not?
Thank you very much, Dr. Ferlito. This is very fascinating discussion on nature of the Austrian economic school and how it's different from other branches. Thank you very much. We'll hope to see you again.
Thanks. Thank you very much. Thank you. See you again.